Alright, welcome. This is EM4 and we are going to be working with the spectrum analyzer with our wire antenna and our loop antenna or hoop antenna. And so let's get started. So the first part that we're going to do, or that I'm going to show you, is that there's this table, and basically the lab manual goes through step by step on how to record all this data. So the first thing that we're going to do is look at the DC marker without any antennas hooked up. So what we're going to do this is we have frequencies, center frequency, and we are going to set that to 25 megahertz. And then we are going to do a span of 100 megahertz. All right, now if you guys have taken signals, basically this is how we do transforms from the time domain to the frequency domain. So this is frequency and this is dB. And so what I will do is I will retrace. Nope, I will do marker's right there. And I'm gonna set marker 0 hertz. And so what this big uptick is our DC. It is our 0 hertz. And that's without any antenna hooked up. And so that is our first observation. Now for our first observation, we can see down here we have our res bandwidth and our video res bandwidth, and then our video bandwidth. So we will record those over here. They are both 1 megahertz. So 1 megahertz and 1 megahertz. All right. And now we will go on to the next part, which is our FM modulation, or frequency modulation. And so what we'll do is we have, so this is for the hoop antenna, we're going to move that aside, and we have our wire antenna, so we're going to plug that in, and we have our wire. And so what we're going to do is we're going to refer to our FM. We are going to set our center frequency to 100 megahertz and our span to 200 megahertz. So frequency, we're setting our center to 100 megahertz and our span to 200 megahertz. So this is what we see. It is very wide, and first thing that we're going to do is, so this is the entire FM band, and so what we're going to do is we're going to record our res and video bandwidth on our table. And so that was for step 1, and so it is the same thing. So this is just meaning it's the same thing. All right, so now to our second part, we are going to change the center frequency to, well, we're going to keep it at 100 megahertz, but our span is going to reduce down to 6 megahertz. Alright, so it might be hard to see, but once we lift the antenna, we can definitely see that there are these frequencies. Now, I can't do both at the same time, so there's a really cool trick that we can do. When we hit view trace, right now it's clear writing, so what that means is that we are constantly updating our spectrum. So here, if we do max hold, that makes it a lot easier. So we're going to record these 3 frequencies. How I'm going to do that is I'm going to hit the marker button, and instead of entering in a value, I'm just going to come over, and so this will be my F1. Okay, my F1 is going to be 98.74 megahertz. All right, and selecting marker again, I will go to the next one. This is going to be my F2. This is 99.95 megahertz. And then I'm going to go to this one, which is 101.92 megahertz. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to focus in on all these. Now what you'll notice is that my res bandwidth and my video bandwidth did change. So my res bandwidth is 30 kilohertz and video bandwidth is 30 kilohertz. All right, so now I am going to do 98.74 with a span of 136. So I am going to do center frequency of 98.74 megahertz with a span of 136 kilohertz. And I'm going to go back to view trace and do clear right. That looks better. All right, so now what we're going to go do is I'm going to hit det demod. And what this is going to allow me to do is I can demodulate the signal using FM. So over here, I'll turn up the volume. So kind of hard to hear. So what I'm going to do is select demod time. I'm going to increase it. So I don't want to increase that more than 2 seconds, so I'm going to leave it there. Let's see. So you'll notice that I have to move the antenna because sitting here, well, first we're in a brick building, and so it's hard for a signal to travel through. So I'm going to increase the volume. This is going on YouTube. I'm not being monetized, so it shouldn't be an issue. I'm going to listen. All right, so that's a pop station. So I am going to write pop, and my res bandwidth is at 1 kilohertz, and video is at 1 kilohertz. All right, so I am gonna turn off demod and change my center frequency to 99.95 megahertz. Go back to det demod. Oop, turn it back on. FM. All right, so that's a country. And my res bandwidth are the same. And remember, this just denotes the same as right above. And now for my center frequency, I will do 101.92 megahertz, same span. Go to det demod, turn it back on. All right, I'm gonna call that oldies. All right, and so for your guys' lab report, I'm gonna turn this off real quick. For your guys' lab report, tell me, how does this frequency match to this? So you're gonna have to do some research on frequencies relating to our stations, because these are radio stations, right? So I want you guys to include in your lab report you know, what is the radio station here, here, and here, and basically kind of explain what is the radio station for all three of these, and what, how does a radio station's number relate to their broadcast frequency. All right, so for the next one, I'm going to hook up the loop antenna, and oh, that kind of cut out. Okay, so I have the loop antenna connected. Our first part is center frequency of 1 megahertz, span of 2 megahertz. Frequency 1 megahertz, span 2 megahertz. All right, now what you'll see here is that is the DC line, and we're not really seeing anything, but something is there. Double check my connections. Those look good. All right, my res bandwidth is at 10 kilohertz and 10 kilohertz. All right, so I'm gonna do the same thing as before, where I'm gonna do a max hold. And basically what I'm gonna do is I'm going to hold on to the base of the loop antenna and try and get a couple of radio stations to show through. Now we do see one over here, and possibly one right there. So this is going to be my A1. My A1 is going to be this one, which is 1.195 megahertz. Res bandwidth, I don't do that yet. All right. And then, all right, when in doubt, just turn it off and on. So, okay, go to marker, and let's double check that. Yep, so 1195 is the first one. And then I'm gonna go back to view trace, max hold, there we go. And that is gonna be our next one. So 1.66 megahertz. All right, so I'm gonna zoom in to those, back to clear right. So frequency, our first one, A1, is 1.195 megahertz, and our span is 136 kilohertz. All right, now this is a really big band, so usually, remember in the first ones we didn't have this big dip up there, but it's a very powerful, so it must be a radio station that's pretty close to us, that's broadcasting close to us. Our res bandwidth is 1 kilohertz and 1 kilohertz for the video. And now we're gonna go to det demod. Now we are gonna do AM. Now in your lab report, I want you to explain, or mention at least, that AM was used for the AM stations, FM was used for FM station, and in your lab report explain what is demod. So do some research on what is demod and how does a spectrum analyzer allow us to use demod to listen to these radio stations. So let's have a listen. All right. Turn up the volume. Okay, I'm going to increase demod time. That's going to cut down on the All right, I'm going to call that a talk station. And you can, again, like you're doing with FM, re-look up and see how does this relate to an actual radio station, and what is the name of the radio station, what do they primarily do. So now we're going to move on to A2. So our frequency will change to 1.66 megahertz. And we'll go back to det demod, AM. Alright, and that's another talk station. So talk station, and the res and video are both 1 kilohertz. Alright, so I will be including this. Now, you're going to have to retype this out, and again, make sure to explain how does our center frequency relate to actual radio stations, and what are the names of all these stations. And that is it. So we have used the spectrum analyzer and used 2 different types of antenna to listen in on radio stations. If you have any questions about the lab report, you can email me at jerica.d.cleveland@ndsu.edu. My email address is also found on the Blackboard under the lab folder on the rubric for the lab reports. And if you have any questions, you can always email me. Thank you for watching. You guys have a great day.